Tonight we're going to be covering chapter 11. It's all about imperfect competition and monopolies. So we're going to be looking specifically at these learning objectives. We're going to have to be able to define and identify the characteristics of monopoly markets. We're going to analyze equilibrium price and output that determine or are determined by these monopolies. We're going to understand how they apply price discrimination strategies, and we're going to compare monopolistic competition to oligopoly market structures. They are similar, they are quite close to each other when we look at the market powers spectrum. But they do have significant differences, so we're going to be able to compare and contrast those. And then finally, we're going to evaluate policy responses to imperfect competition. I'm sure you know we have a competition commission in South Africa, and they're responsible for making sure that we don't create monopolies we can't control. Okay, so quick introduction and again a bit of revision because we have covered these basic market structures. We're just going to be covering them in a little bit more detail in this chapter. So imperfect competition exists between these extremes. So if you look to the right, I've given you a little diagram of how these different market structures exist on the spectrum. So as you can see, we go from perfect competition, where all your market participants are price takers. No one participant can influence market price, all the way down to monopolies, where they dictate the price. Okay, so they are the price makers. Okay, so we're going to look at how each of these is represented in the real world market and look at some examples as we go along too. So the key forms of imperfect competition, it's when you have monopolistic competition, it means that many firms are selling differentiated products. Okay, so that's when you have, for example, when you think of having a steak, if you think first of Spur, that's a monopolistic competition. Okay, so clothing brands, if you need a new pair of jeans and the first thing you think is Levi's, that's monopolistic competition. There's not a lot of things that compete with those very differentiated products. So Levi's, for example, demands a market premium because originally they started as being an extremely durable substance in industrial environments. So Levi jeans, you couldn't burn through them. And that's why they became very popular in the beginning and they were totally worth the money. Accelerate a few decades, and Levi's has now established themselves as being a high quality clothing item. And then they simply tailor made it for a consumer market rather than an industrial market while maintaining the same quality levels. Okay, so they created a monopolistic competition. So they dictate the price of their jeans. Okay, there's not much that can sort of infringe on how much people are willing to pay for Levi jeans. Okay, same thing happens with Spur. Obviously, they have more competition in that arena, but because they're a South African favorite, again, they're an established brand, well known in South Africa, well loved. So they do operate on a monopolistic sort of environment, mostly because people attached a lot of their memories to like restaurant environments and things like that. So they can increase their prices by like 10, 15, 20%, and they will still not lose a lot of market share. Okay, so with oligopolies, that's when you have a few large industries or large firms dominating the market. Typical examples, automobile industry. Okay, that's becoming a little bit more saturated, shall we say, since we have a lot of Asian competition. But originally, it was essentially you had your German, your Italian car makers who were receiving competition from the occasional American cars, and we had manufacturing hubs for cars. So you get like Detroit, and then you'd get like the Ferrari coming out of my goodness, my memory escapes me, but like an Italian factory in a specific town where everybody is sort of, you know, employed by the town, sort of like Utne here in Port Elizabeth. We have VW, and Goodyear, and well, not for very long because due to the tariffs and recent economic conditions, Goodyear is actually shutting down. But because we have VW in this small industrial town, every company around it supports that one major manufacturer. Okay, so in an oligopoly, that's sort of how they work. They create their competitive position, not on the differentiated products, but on their supply chains. Okay, so same thing happens in the telecommunications industry, specifically in South Africa. We have MTN, Vodacom, Cell C, and Telkom Mobile. Okay, so we have four um, suppliers competing for market share. But what really happens is that Vodacom and MTN really control the market because they're the ones that have the infrastructure. So what ends up happening is that Cell C and Telkom end up renting the infrastructure from the two behemoths. So they are really an oligopoly. They are just two large firms dominating the market. If you want to sell telecommunications services in South Africa, you have to go through MTN and Vodacom. Okay, so then we have the complete opposite side of the spectrum where you get a single seller. There are no substitutes and there is blocked entry. We will look at specific examples, but I'm sure the first one that comes to every South African's mind is Eskom. Okay. Because obviously we are completely at the will of the dealer. If they are unable to meet our demand or provide the supply that is required by the grid, we are unfortunately left with no substitutes, no alternatives, and there are no competitors that can reasonably enter the market. I have to say, Cyril Ramaphosa, our wonderful president, has made some great strides in that direction because he opened the market to smaller suppliers, obviously not large enough to pose any sort of threat to Eskom, but he did say you could create about 100 megawatts of your own power. So obviously that would mean like the mining companies are essentially being pushed off the grid or encouraged off the grid. And because mining companies, mines in particular, tend to be quite concentrated users of electricity, if we can encourage them off the grid and to create their own and generate their own electricity, it would really take a lot of pressure off Eskom, which is actually what has happened and why we've had a lot less load shedding. Because a lot of even it's come down to the fact that even individuals have left the grid. So it does represent a permanent loss of income to Eskom, but obviously because the government was well aware that Eskom was not able to meet the demand, they did open up the market just a little bit, enough to take the pressure off Eskom as a monopoly supplier. Okay, so there are obviously contrasting market structures. Unlike perfect competition, imperfect competition involves price setting power and or differentiated products. Okay, so when we are looking at these monopolies, it stands in stark contrast to perfect competition. So perfect competition obviously represents everyone has perfect access to information. All the products are homogenous. Everyone is a price taker. There is no differentiation based on product. You can't make abnormal profits. Everything is very well sort of unregulated. You have free entry and exit, and there are many buyers and sellers, of course. Okay, so a pure monopoly is a market structure that exists when everybody else is being blocked out of the market. You'll notice that there are a few ways that companies and even countries achieve this. Okay, so by definition, if I'm sure it will be asked in the exam, because this is obviously where the majority of your questions will come from. So the definition, if you're asked for like 2 to 4 marks, only one seller of that good or service, no close substitutes. Entry to the market is completely blocked off. So that's the key definition. But now the key characteristics of this market structure is that the monopolist is the entire industry. Okay, so unlike perfect competition, where everyone is a participant in the market with equal rights and equal opportunities to buy the products that they want, a monopolist owns the industry. Okay, so very much like, for example, if you are the main manufacturer in a town, you are the monopolist in the labor market. Okay, so you can dictate what you choose to pay people, which is why when these car manufacturers leave a town, they tend to essentially decimate the labor market and the town itself. Because if no income is being generated, obviously people end up having to leave. So it faces a downward sloping demand curve, unlike in perfect competition. So in perfect competition, you obviously have your horizontal line, which means that any deviation in the market price will result in infinite loss in market share. So if you deviate even slightly, it's like in our current market for, let's look at a perfect competition. Let's look at the market for salt. Okay, there we have many buyers, many sellers. No one's particularly brand loyal. I mean, we like Cerebos, but if it's not available, we're not overly fussy over the brand of salt we acquire typically. The products are more or less perfectly homogeneous, salt is salt. And if they were to deviate, so when it comes down to it, when a individual is making a buying decision, they're going to look at that 20% difference and buy the cheaper product. So simply by not maintaining the exact prescribed market price, everyone could choose your competition. And of course, part of the perfect competition market is that there are endless substitutes and no switching costs. So you can simply just choose another product. Okay. So unlike a unlike a perfect competition, a monopoly looks much more like the demand curve we're used to seeing, which means that as the prices drop, your quantity will increase. Obviously, that does depend very much on affordability. You can see that on markets like, let's look at another extreme, like Ozempic. Okay, so this is a miraculous weight loss drug. Let's excuse all of the egregious medical violations that they're currently being sued for, and let's pretend that this is just a perfect market. Because they are the only people who create this wonderful miracle drug, or there's very few people in this market, so they have either a monopoly or monopolistic competition, they can dictate the price. They are now having celebrities outpricing themselves from the market, okay? Because the celebrities are now throwing money at this pharmaceutical company in order to get access to this one product. So it's a fascinating case study, and rarely happens in real life, but when it does, it's very exciting to see. So it acts as a price setter, but it's still constrained by the market demand. So you can have a scenario where you simply just price yourself out of the market, where people just realize, you know what, it's just too much money, too much risk attached to it. Okay, the typical example of a perfect market, a perfect competition is the stock market, for example. There you simply have the price of your shares are dictated by the inherent value of the company. Okay, but you are buying a share, you are buying a piece of paper. It is a homogeneous product. The value of that product is dictated entirely by the market, by the demand and supply. So in that scenario, if you are to say, present your initial market offering, so your IPO price is set 10% above what your auditors and actuaries say it should be, there's a very good chance no one will buy your share because you are simply pricing yourself out of the market. Okay, so a stock market is a perfect example of looking at multiple different commodities, materials, companies, and you can see how the market is actively interacting. They're connecting buyers and sellers. And because there's an endless market because there's endless numbers of buyers and sellers interacting on an open stock market. So everybody is essentially a price taker. So it is a perfect market. So on the other hand, with a monopoly, you really have to push your prices very far out of kilter for people to not take your product anymore. For example, if Eskom, they've put us through multiple rates hikes, unexpected, obviously impacting the most vulnerable of our society, the ones who are not receiving the subsidies. So it obviously impacts like your middle class, the people who are paying high amounts for electricity, and doesn't impact the people who are now getting off the grid. So what the market constraint there is, because electricity got so expensive and so unreliable, people were just finding the only alternative, which is essentially to equip their houses to fulfill this need. Okay, so pure monopoly is always rare. The South African railways are also another near monopoly, mostly because all private companies are prohibited from operating on our railways. Okay, that also leads to a lot of degradation because we can't get private investors. It means that the responsibility falls on the taxpayer to maintain the railways, maintain the trains. Obviously, that's quite a difficult thing to do if the railways, essentially start costing us more value than they create. Okay, so we have to look at how these monopolies are created in the real world. So in real life, these pure monopolies are extremely rare. People are, especially governments, are really at odds with natural market mechanisms when they secure these monopolies. But I'll give you a couple of examples of how they've done it in real life, and it's really fascinating the strategy behind it. So many markets feature these near monopolies with these very dominant firms controlling the majority of the market share. Now, how they do this is typically things like legal barriers. So patents and licenses, specifically in things like the medical and pharmaceutical industry. Okay, once you patent something, you have the license on it for like 20 years. Okay, and then you simply have to, and this is what they do in practice to maintain their monopoly, is that they make minor alterations to the patents once that 20 years elapses, and then they, apply for a new patent based on this slight variation. It's actually very clever and it's worked very well. Then you've got these government franchises. Of course, there's with Eskom, we are legally prevented from opening up any company which offers any threat to the Eskom monopoly. Okay, you also can't build your own railways. Okay, that float freely around the country or around the continent. Okay, so there's also resource control. Okay, this is where you have companies like De Beers. They have complete ownership over the essential resources like the diamond market. Okay, it is because they have the license, they have the properties, they have the mines, the equipment, the infrastructure, they have legal barriers in place because they control the resources. It is impossible to enter that market. Okay, so without even prescribing legally that you cannot enter that market, they still completely dominate it. Okay, then you have more natural monopolies. Okay, these are economies of scale. Economies of scale are where you simply are just so good at what you've done. Okay, so for example, like Levi jeans, they can demand a very high price for a product that probably doesn't cost them that much to produce. Why? They've been producing it for decades. They've got it down to a fine art. Because they can produce so much, they can produce these large volumes. They have achieved economies of scale. So as you increase the quantity you produce, you decrease the average cost of production for that one product. So we have quite a few examples of that, like Google. Okay, economies of scale. They simply cannot be touched because they are just so huge. Okay, it's literally become a verb to Google it. So they've achieved economies of scale because despite the fact that, fascinating fact is that they only cover about 4% of the entire World Wide Web. They still are 92% of global search market. So they simply dominate the market. Okay, there are also network effects. Okay, so we're talking about social media platforms like Facebook, Meta, X. Their value increases with the user base. So obviously, we saw this when Meta started Threads, obviously in competition with X. It didn't really go down too well. Okay. And Threads essentially almost disappeared off the scene. A similar thing is now happening to ChatGPT. They had incredible network effects. They had, within the first month of existing, they had 1 million users sign up across the world. It was absolutely incredible. But in the last quarter, they have actually recorded their first restrictions. The market is actually declining already. So it seems like we've already hit the peak of AI integration, despite the fact that everyone is heavily investing into AI at the moment. So tech platforms largely get their value from the user base. Um, there's actually a study, one I wrote, on how network value could actually support, it actually proves that digital currencies are inherently based on the number of users who access your blockchain. Because it obviously relates to the number of transactions, the number of wallets that are available, how actively people, transact with one another. It increases the value of the blockchain, which then increases the value of the digital currency. So technology tends to work with network effects. So, yeah, if you are asked about it, these four are particularly useful, sources for monopolistic power. Then, of course, there are geographic considerations. Now, this is much easier to sort of maintain depending on how far away from everything you are. So, I'm sure you've been on the long road, for example, between Durban and Johannesburg. Okay, it's just a straight road. There's not much that happens. There are a few towns along the way. Now, each of those little towns has a monopoly essentially over petrol stations, depending on how far apart they are from one another. But those little shell garages along the way, if you're running out of petrol, they pretty much have the monopoly over your money. Because it's not like you can go to any competitors or freely switch. So essentially, the further out you are, the more regionally you are protected. You have a moat around your market. So it even happens in competitive national markets, So, like I said, even though petrol is freely available in our country, on certain long roads, yeah, not so much. Okay, so we've got some real world examples which may be useful to just draw on for the exam as well. So, with regards to infrastructure and utilities, these are typically companies that either have resource control or legal barriers. So, South African, the railway system, our telecommunications, obviously, is more resource control because they control the infrastructure and the grid. Local water and electricity providers, as we discussed, legal barriers there. You can't start your own, you can start your water purification, systems, but you can't take over the water treatment plant or create your own. Okay. Then of course we have got our tech companies, and this is where your network effects come in. So we've got, Google, Microsoft, Windows. Windows is a fascinating monopoly because essentially what they've done is they've used, and Apple has also copied this model, so has BMW. What they do is they give you advantages to simply upgrading to their new version of their new system. And they simply do a facelift, slight upgrade, and you have to do it. And after a while, they just stop, providing any support to the previous models. It's very clever, really, but it does keep us very engaged. Also, they also have a sort of resource control because every new computer essentially comes out with a Windows license. So we also look for desktop computers and laptops that have that feature because you don't have to buy it yourself. Same thing when you are an iPhone user, when you're an Apple user, that's what you want. You want an Apple store, you don't want anything, any nonsense. But if you're an Android user, it's a hard come down from having access to pretty much anything you can imagine to a more restricted Apple store, even though they have much better quality, much higher restriction levels. Still, there's that economies of scale from the advantage of having pretty much anyone who chooses to be a developer can develop for Android. There's much more control in the Apple market. Okay, because they dominate based on the differentiated version of their product. So their iPhones, their Apple products are all linked to their Apple Store, which has insane restrictions. Okay, people spend years developing applications for the store, and when they're rejected, they're simply just, yeah, company destroyed, dreams dashed. Try again later. And of course, then they move to Android. Okay. So then we've got the more notable examples as well. These are the people who have sort of created a monopoly based on either resource control, like De Beers, or Luxottica. I don't know. I'll never quite be able to pronounce that. But those very fancy brands like your Louis Vuittons, your Gucci's, your Dolce, all of these wonderful eyewear creators and clothing brands and makeup manufacturers, they have created their monopoly based on brand name recognition, um, premium aspirations, or aspirations in their consumers. They've created a brand surrounded around differentiation. And then, of course, you've got your regional healthcare providers. The you're like in more populated areas of the country, you will have a higher concentration of hospitals, but there are things like ambulance services, which fall to horrific levels in the Eastern Cape because there is a specific ratio that is meant to be maintained. So there should be like, I can't remember the exact ratio, but I think it's one ambulance to every 1,400 people or something like that. And currently we're sitting like closer to 5,000 or 12,000 people. So it does cause a bit of a problem. But if you are one of the few ambulance providers in the Eastern Cape, well, good on you. Which is why we pay exorbitant fees when we have an emergency. Okay, so what this market structure actually looks like as a diagram. You may be asked to draw this in the exam, but don't panic. I'm gonna walk you through it. And of course, you can take pictures of this and just sort of memorize it just before you go into the exam. Okay, so most important characteristics. You have your downward sloping demand curve. Okay, so here it is. As your price decreases, so your quantity demanded increases. Okay, you have your market revenue, which falls below your average revenue. Okay, so your average demand. Your marginal revenue is, of course, the revenue that you receive from selling one additional unit. So you can see here, as a monopoly, despite the demand, they would not necessarily always provide the full market demand. They would rather provide fewer and create a steeper demand curve, a steeper marginal revenue curve for themselves, because if they provide like fewer units to the market, they create a bidding war over the units they have released. So a premiumization. Okay, so if they want to sell more units, okay, and instead of going for the more, a perfectly inelastic market demand, then they have to just simply lower their prices, and then you get closer to your average revenue curve. Okay, so profit maximization is achieved when your marginal revenue equals your marginal cost. Okay, so what that means is that when your marginal revenue, so the amount of money that you receive from selling one additional unit, equals the amount that it cost you to produce that extra unit, that is where you have maximized your profit. That is the point where you stop producing. Okay, everything is great. You have now reached the pinnacle of your profit arc. Okay, so you can set your prices higher than perfect competition prices. Okay, so you can go slightly beyond what the market would dictate. You can also produce at less than the market dictates. Okay, so you can produce, like we said, you can provide fewer units to the market and create a bidding war. And your economic profit is then calculated by looking at the market price minus your average cost multiplied by the quantity you have sold to the market. Okay, if that sounds a little bit confusing, remember that your economic profits are not like your accounting profits. You are looking at your potential, your opportunity cost. So how much could you have made if you had succumbed to the market price versus your average cost? So essentially you're saying, what would my profit have been for every unit? And then you're multiplying it by the number of units you've sold. Okay, so if that seems simpler. Obviously, for your accounting profit, you would simply need to look at your total revenue, subtract your total costs, and that will give you your basic profit margin, your gross profit. Okay, sorry, just a quick, I'm just checking my timing. Okay, we're right on time. Okay, so with this equilibrium analysis, okay, so equilibrium will always represent the point where we are balanced. So exactly what it sounds like. So at what point have you achieved the number of units outputs or the production level that is now giving you everything you need to cover your costs and giving you your optimal level of profit? Because remember, you can't, if you simply keep producing, you would lose that premium aspect of your product. So there's a fine balance. Even when you're a monopoly, you want to provide enough to the market to maintain your monopoly. But at the same time, you don't want to price yourself out of the market and create, push people off your Eskom grid, nor do you want to provide too much to the market, like the oil market, the OPEC dictators. Okay, the OPEC society or committee that decides how much oil gets released into the global supply. When they decide that they want the price of oil to go up slightly, they simply reduce the quantities of barrels supplied to the open market. And then Brent crude oil spikes in price, they haven't lost anything because the amount that they lost in quantity, they have now compensated for in revenue. So it's a fine line, when you are a monopoly, you want to maximize your profits. So you watch your production very closely. Okay, so in order to reach this optimal level, your marginal revenue must equal your marginal cost. The shutdown rule, however, is that you produce only if the average revenue you are receiving from each unit, obviously that would be your market price, is greater than your average variable cost. Now, remember when we talk about costs, when we talk about total costs, there are two factors that we consider: average variable cost and average fixed cost. The average part simply means that we take the total cost or the cost for that specific factor, either variable or fixed, and we divide it by the total numbers produced by that factory. Okay, so that's what average means. Variable implies it's either the amount changes per month. In other words, if we produce more, let's say, what are those little knitted bears? Okay, so in order to produce 5 knitted bears, we need 5 people to produce them. Okay, so you can see there we would have wool expenditure as material costs, and we would have the number of people that we employ, the labor costs, as our variable costs. Because if we wanted to increase our output to 10, we would have to increase both the wool and the number of people we employ. Okay, so that's what average variable cost is. Obviously, average fixed cost is all of your fixed costs, so everything that doesn't change month to month, so your rent, your utilities, things that you're contractually obligated to pay, like a premium every month. Those are your fixed costs. We also divide those costs over the average production or each unit, but we're mostly concerned about the variable costs in this scenario, okay? Because fixed costs have a trend to permanently come down. The more you produce, the more units your fixed costs are spread across. Therefore, fixed costs have a continual declining basis, but variable costs have a point where, for example, you could produce with those same teddy bear example, you could maybe produce 6 or 7 bears without employing an additional person. Okay, they get better, they get slightly faster. The only increase in variable cost is really materials. But by the time you start wanting to produce 8 or 9 bears, now you have to employ another person. Again, still another person, you're still producing more bears. There's still an advantage to producing more units because now you have 6 people working. You may be paying more for wool, but you're receiving 3 extra bears. But by the time you get to the 10th bear, you may now have a problem with that you simply do not have enough sewing machines. I know you don't necessarily use sewing machines for knitting bears, but you understand what I'm saying. Okay, so you have limited capital, limited machinery, limited space in which these 6 people can work. So in order to achieve your short-term objective of reaching 10 units and doubling your previous production, you want to have to now employ a 7th person. And at this point, everyone is now, sort of overlapping, which means that we can't actually produce that 10th bear. If we do, we are going to have to pay more people. We're not making the same level of profit. And in fact, over time, say we want to push it to 12 people, at that point, it becomes overcrowded. And the people that we have employed now start becoming less and less productive. So they start producing fewer units, which ends up raising our average variable cost because we're simply not producing the units while maintaining the additional costs of the labor and the wool. Okay, so the rule is we produce until a point that our average revenue no longer exceeds our average variable costs. Okay, so that makes sense. At that point, you'll see that if you know anybody who works in manufacturing, This is something they track very carefully. So what happens typically when this occurs in real life is that we'll have a change in shifts. Okay, so we will run overtime, we'll run swing shifts, but as soon as we reach a point where the average revenue we're returning is now no longer higher than what a shift is costing us and what materials are costing us, we shut down the plant. Okay, so we do short time, we start, doing weekend shifts, shutting down shifts, only running, part time, which means you only run, say, one of three shifts that typically run in manufacturing. If that happens over a long period of time, obviously disastrous for your company. Typically, you end up shutting down. So if entry is blocked, monopolists can maintain economic profit, but only when your price is higher than your average cost. Okay. It's pretty logical once you understand what we're looking at. So as long as your income is higher than your expenses, you can still produce in the long run. You're still going to be good. Okay, but of course, we do want to operate at an ideal point. Okay, so I just want to touch on the key differences from the perfect competition. I know I do the back and forth quite a bit, but I do want you to have a very clear compare and contrast idea in your mind because it's very likely to pop up in the exam again. Okay, so monopolists produce less output at higher price than perfectly competitive firms. Why? Because arguably in a perfectly competitive market, there is an endless demand for your product. Okay, that's what that horizontal line represents. If you go above market price, your entire market share disappears, but you also have access to an infinite um, demand. So if you produce it, you can sell it. Unfortunately, that does not work the same way in a monopoly. They take advantage of higher prices to produce less. Okay. So there is no supply curve really. Output and price depend on on both the marginal cost and the market demand. So here it's not about, so typically we have a demand and supply curve like we do with perfect competition, and the market is what dictates the price. But in a monopoly or monopolistic market, there is no supply. You are not making decisions on the spur of the moment of how much to sell. You have already pre-decided what the supply will be. The only decision is really price, how much you are willing to sell your products for and how much of the market you're willing to supply. Okay, so you can only maximize your profit as long as your demand elasticity is greater than 1. Okay, so it's the elastic portion of it. So the fun thing is that monopolists always operate in the elastic portion of the demand. Okay, so what that means is that a relatively small change in price will have very little impact on the number of people who are willing to buy your product. Okay. An inelastic demand, of course, is what perfect competition experiences. And the perfect version of that inelasticity is if there is any small fractional change in price, your entire market disappears. Okay, so there is a deadweight loss that occurs for society. If you'll remember when we do that, um, the demand and supply curves for the market, we look at consumer and producer surplus. And then we also looked at when there is an artificial intervention by government and they come in and they set a price, then there was a deadweight loss to society because we are no longer experiencing that consumer surplus or the producer surplus is no longer there. So it represents a deadweight loss. And that occurs because a monopolist produces less than is socially optimal. Okay, they produce to their maximum profitization. Okay, the other thing that they are involved in is price discrimination. So, what you'll find with Eskom, perfect example, is that not everybody pays the same for electricity. Okay, so if you come from a more affluent, forgive me, area in the country, you will pay more for electricity. Okay, you pay more for utilities. This has created a bit of a problem, which I will also explain as we go along. Okay, so price discrimination is essentially selling the same product to different groups and customers at differing prices. If you go from different retail stores as well, like supermarkets and markets, you, I'm sure, have also noticed that there are differences in prices that don't quite make sense. Okay, so only when customer place have different values on the same product can we identify it as price discrimination. It's entirely legal and a lot of companies do it. Okay. So for example, we will pay a lot for a VW in for an Audi in South Africa because it's imported, but because if it's manufactured in Germany, of course, they pay less for it. Okay, there's lots of different reasons for price discrimination, which is why it's not illegal. Some of them are entirely justified. So if it's more travel time to deliver your product to Mpumalanga rather than George, then depending on your location, then obviously it would make sense for you to ascribe a higher price to the person who is further from you. Okay, so like I said, these are just profit maximization strategies as well, because obviously, if there is an opportunity to charge a slightly higher price, you are almost justified in doing that for like equity reasons, because by charging more to some more people who have more disposable income, you can charge less to people who have less disposable income and less, you know, elasticity in their pricing. Now, there are three types of discrimination. Okay, so this occurs when a firm sells, of course, the same product to different buyers at different prices based on what a customer is willing to pay. Okay, so we have the first degree. Okay, this is the perfect version. Okay, this is charging each customer their maximum willingness to pay. Okay, this is what happens when you haggle at a flea market. Okay, that's when you negotiate. Also, if you are walking into to buy a car, for example, there is some negotiation that can happen there. Okay, so it's one-on-one, you versus the salesperson, mono e mono. Okay, that is ideally how they'd actually like to run a lot of hospitality industry as well. So they want to charge you the most you would possibly pay for a hotel room, not the least. Okay. Or flights as well. Obviously, the closer you are to the booking date or to the flight date, the more they can charge you. They can price gouge you based on your desperation, which apparently an AI can smell. Okay, so the second degree is quantity based. Okay, so this is where we get bulk discounts. Think macro, think these massive loyalty programs. There are also tiered pricing plans. Okay, so this also happens with quite prestigious brands like Nike, for example. So Nike operates on a system with all of their retail providers that the number of Nikes you sell and the level of prestige they attach to your brand determines the types of products that you can sell. So you only have access to a certain category within their catalog based on you as your prestige as a retailer, how long you've been there, how much you sell, and how well known you are, essentially. Okay, this caused a bit of a problem during COVID when everybody just stopped buying it, and Nike couldn't adjust fast enough. So they essentially had limited edition products which were being stored in their warehouses because they didn't have the distribution infrastructure to push it out because it would mean destroying their whole tiered system. Rather disastrously, actually, what ended up happening was that Nike ended up having to sell their limited edition, only available in these Gucci stores, um, sneakers, um, at discount prices. Horrible situation, very embarrassing. Okay, then of course there is the third degree. Okay, this is much more easy to, you know, to see, to identify. You get student discounts. I'm sure you guys have seen those. There are senior rates, okay? Hopefully you don't have to use those for a while, but there are things like, for example, on Wednesdays, Fruit and Veg has a 20% discount for pensioners. There is geographic pricing. Have you ever been to a sports event? Okay, the second you walk inside that stadium, the price of everything goes up. Okay, simply because it is too difficult to leave to buy something that you want. So you're completely at the will of the dealer there. Not much you can do about it. Okay. Then, okay, so the real example, of course, are like your airlines, your telecommunications companies, doctors. Okay, they also have sliding fees. If you take a look at how your medical aid plan works, you'll see that doctors typically can charge 100% or up to 300% your medical aid rate. So, despite the fact that we have legislation that largely is supposedly supposed to protect us, uh, healthcare professionals can still charge considerably higher than the prescribed medical aid rates, which is, interesting. The interesting thing about ESCOM as well, like I said, there are differing rates for different residential, commercial, and industrial customers and areas. So what ended up happening was because a lot of people, especially the people who could afford the massive 500 to 200,000 Rand upgrades to their homes by putting in solar panels and generators, etc. Um, because they were essentially generating enough electricity for themselves and others, ESCOM essentially started broaching the subject of buying that electricity to push back into the grid. The problem was that the people who are now generating this electricity, this extra electricity, in more affluent areas were being charged higher rates than the people who weren't able to generate their own residential electricity. So essentially, ESCOM was running a losing game at potentially paying these people because they were only being able to charge very low rates to people who couldn't get off the grid and pay much higher rates to people who were already off the grid because they were being charged high levels already. So, sometimes running at abnormally high profits or price discrimination can lead to unintended effects, shall we say. Okay, so the seller must be the price setter. Okay, they have to have some market power in order to be able to enact price discrimination. If you don't have power, people will simply go somewhere else. Markets must be separable. Okay, there is no arbitrage, which means that nobody should be able to come to your store, buy a product, and then sell it at a higher price somewhere else. Okay, so there's no arbitrage. Arbitrage is when you take advantage in differences and different prices in different markets for the same product. Okay, so if you look at currency investors or currency traders, they tend to try to take advantage of arbitrage, but you're looking at fractional differences, cents that happen in like milliseconds. You have to be able to move large amounts of cash or be able to wait long periods of time. So essentially, arbitrage is buying something when it's cheap and selling it when it's more expensive, but taking advantage of the fact that these two different markets is trying to sell the same product but at different prices. Okay, so there are different customer groups must have different price elasticities. So obviously the reason that ESCOM was able to do this is because people in more affluent areas are willing to pay more for electricity because their lives run on, online a lot of the time. So people who are typically not used to having a permanent supply of electricity are less willing to part with things like, bare necessities in order to have this electricity. So there are massive differences in elasticities, which means that changes in price don't necessarily influence the more affluent people, but they will impact the more vulnerable people in our society. Okay, so when we look at these graphically, okay, I doubt they will actually ask you this, but it is useful to just be able to, have a visual representation of price discrimination. So when you are looking at a one-to-one first degree basis, you are looking at negotiation. Each unit can be sold at the maximum price that a consumer is willing to pay. It also gives you a lot because they are almost banking on the ability of the salesperson to manipulate you into paying a higher price. It does mean there's a lot more wiggle room. There can be customization included in the first degree. In the second degree, it's mostly about bulk orders. You are being provided with, additional services, or because you're a good customer, you can have discounts on, specific products and agreements. Okay, ESCOM has electricity blocks. So for example, we all buy within specific ranges, okay, or what is it? They are blocks, essentially, yes. So if you go to the first block, you pay quite a low amount for electricity. As soon as you move to the second block, you start paying more by the third block. So it actually has no real difference when you buy electricity in the month, because your new gauge starts at the first of every month. So as long as you stay below, like, I know, like for my family to stay under the first block, it costs us about 800 Rand. Okay, but then as soon as we go into the second block, we're now moving to like 1,200 Rand. But by the time you get to the third block, for the same amount of electricity, you're now paying like well over 2,000 Rand. So the more electricity you use, the more electricity or the more you pay for each unit of electricity. Okay, so yeah, like I said, it can backfire, but typically it's quite a smart way to do things. You almost penalize heavy users. Then you've got the third degree. Okay, so this looks at like generalized, you sort of you're trimming the market here. You're specifically segmenting the market. So if you're looking at, for example, senior discounts or student discounts, okay, so there you're probably relying on the fact that they're like banks offer senior discounts because they will typically do fewer transactions. Okay, students also probably have access to less money, so less capital concerns. Then you've got even hotels and airlines do peak versus off-peak pricing because they know that there are going to be times when everybody wants to take a holiday, so they price gouge you. There's also the geographic pricing we discussed. So the further away from convenience you are, or the more convenient you are, the more you can charge. Okay, so section 3, we're getting to the end of our lecture now. So beyond the monopoly, other imperfect markets. So we can't talk about monopolies in isolation because very close to it is the oligopoly forms of markets. Okay, so they are also imperfect competition and they're almost more dangerous because these are companies, very powerful actors in our market, which are almost pretending to be independent institutions, but are still moving together. So they provide the impression of being more, perfectly competitive or more competitive, while really acting more like a monopoly just together. So between the two extremes, we have this monopolistic competition where we have many firms, differentiated products, and then we've got these oligopolies where we have a few large firms that may compete or collude. Okay. I don't think it's any, coincidence that all of our banking um, price levels get readjusted at the same time every year. Yeah, I'm sure that has nothing to do with anything. Just kidding. Anyway, so then we have monopolistic competition. There's many different firms selling differentiated products. Okay, there are no barriers to entry. Okay, so typical examples of this would be like McDonald's, you've got your Burger King. They are well established based on their brand name and their recognizability, their goodwill, if you're looking at for an accounting term. They have a downward sloping demand. The price dictates how many units are sold. They do have price differentiation. You know when you're eating a McDonald's burger, one way or the other. There's no long-term supernormal profits. They essentially try to prescribe more to market penetration. They don't try to like price gouge you. They try to just maintain your customer and brand loyalty. Okay, then when you come to an oligopoly, okay, here you've got cartels like the OPEC. They are the oil producers. They act together. Okay, everybody knows that they're the oil cartel. There's no fuss about it. We have to negotiate with them. Okay. There's also Coca-Cola, another example of an oligopoly. Obviously, Coca-Cola has a considerable footprint in different across all beverages, even across just beverages and food, really. Unilever as well, very hard to compete with because they essentially dominate the markets they're in. And car manufacturers also tend to align themselves. So entry-level cars have a consistent price level, slightly better car models, and then your luxury car models are all sort of priced in a similar range, which is why even when you're renting a car, they have, classes of cars. So they all have, almost agreements about what they will put in their cars and how much they'll charge for those features. So, key features, there is a lot of interdependence, there's some strategic behavior, potential for collusion, and they tend to lead the prices. So, if F&B starts charging 200 Rand to their premium clients, then and you're an ABSA client, you may be wondering what features you're missing out on not being an F&B client. So ABSA's like, no problem. We'll charge you 200 Rand. No problem. Um, so they tend to move together so that you don't feel like you're being cheated either, and they can get the most you are willing to pay. Okay, then there's these competition strategies. So there's non-price competition. It's basically product diversification and brand loyalty. They use a lot of money on advertising and research and development in order to reinforce both of those things. Okay, so here we have an overall summary. If you want, you can just print this out or take a picture, just so that have a quick reference if ever you need it. Oh, goodness, I have gone over time, but I'm so close to the end. Okay, I'm going to keep going. I'll be very quick. Okay, so this is just a complete summary of everything we've covered up until now. I will cover this part again if you do need to leave, so no problem. Okay, there is the full competitive spectrum. It covers everything you sort of need to know with examples if you get asked for it in the exam. Please remember that if it's think 1 mark per fact. So if we ask you about the different market structures, think that you'll probably get a mark for just naming them, for identifying them, if we haven't given it to you in the question. Then for defining them, you'll get another mark, and then for providing examples. Okay. Okay, on second thought, I will actually cover this in the next section. We do have 2 lectures and only 1 more chapter to cover. So we will have some time, and I don't want to rush these efficiency considerations and policy interventions. But that is the last thing we will cover. But I'll pick up here again next week. Okay, we have run a little bit over time. But otherwise, Jocelyn, if you don't have any questions, I think I will close off for this evening so you can enjoy the rest of your evening. Get back to your family.